Sejam bem-vindos e bem-vindas à 16ª Cineop, Mostra de Cinema de Ouro Preto, o evento da preservação, história e educação, o evento que trata cinema como patrimônio. Aqui o território é da diversidade, das imagens e espaços que nos representam, que constroem identidades, novas formas de criação e conexões. Você vai assistir agora a Masterclass com o tema Registrar é Lutar, o audiovisual como ferramenta na luta por direitos. É com prazer que recebemos nossa convidada, Yvonne Ng, gerente do programa de arquivos da Witness, onde treina e apoia parceiros na coleta, gerenciamento e preservação de documentação em vídeo para a defesa de direitos humanos. Ela também desenvolve recursos de treinamento relacionados à gestão de arquivos e preservação. Antes de ingressar na Witness em 2009, Yvonne trabalhou como pesquisadora no projeto de preservação da televisão pública digital e nas bibliotecas da New York University, NYU, na Biblioteca Pública de Nova York e no Centro de Distribuição dos Cineastas Canadenses. Yvonne tem mestrado em Moving Image Archiving and Preservation pela NYU e bacharelado em Cinema Studies pela University of Toronto. Yvonne atuou anteriormente no Conselho de Diretores da Associação de Arquivistas de Imagens em Movimento, a AMIA. Eu sou Inês Azengart Menezes, co-curadora da temática Preservação da 16ª Cineop e vou mediar esse encontro. Yvonne, thank you so much for joining us. I thank you. You're gonna present and then we talk afterwards. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Inez. It's a real pleasure to be here. Also, thank you to Laura and Danny for all of your support in the background, making this happen. It's so nice to be part of this event, this festival that's dedicated to audiovisual preservation. And I'm here today, as Inez, I think, mentioned, to talk about Witness's work and the history and evolution of our video archives and our archiving work. So I'm just going to share my screen. You can see the slides?
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, so as I mentioned, I'm going to talk about Witness's work and the history of our video archive. So the name of my presentation is 30 Years of Human Rights Video, looking back and looking ahead at the Witness archives, because we are about to enter our 30th year at Witness starting next year. So as Inez mentioned, my name is Yvonne Ng, and I manage the archives program at Witness. So today, what I'd like to share with you is just to talk a little bit about Witness, and with a focus especially on our work in Brazil, and then talk about the evolution of our video archives in the sort of the context of the vastly changed human rights and video landscapes over the last 30 years. So talking about the transition from our tape to our digital workflows, and now more recently, our shift to what's sometimes called a post-custodial approach to our archives program, and also our partnership with the City of Malmö Archives in Sweden. And then finally, I'm going to close my presentation just by pointing to the future and looking at some of the emerging challenges and opportunities that we see arising in relation to human rights and video archives. So for anyone who's not familiar with Witness, we're an international nonprofit organization whose mission is to help people use video and technology to protect and defend human rights. And as I mentioned, we're about to enter our 30th year. We were founded in 1992. So we work in different regions around the world through our regional programs. We have regional programs in the United States, Latin America and the Caribbean, Brazil, as I mentioned, Middle East and North Africa, Africa and Asia and Pacific. We also have programs that are not specific to regions. So for instance, I manage the archives program, and we also have programs in videos evidence and in technology. So in terms of how we do our work, you could sort of think about it in 4 different sort of buckets or areas. So the first important part of our work is just listening and anticipating. So that means building trusted relationships over time, reaching out and making cross-regional and regional connections, and really trying to respond to needs expressed by frontline human rights defenders and working in solidarity with them. So for instance, we participate in a lot of coalitions and we help to build up networks such as the Video for Change Network, which is global and based primarily in Southeast Asia. Coalitions like the Keep It On Coalition, which fights against internet shutdowns, and many others. The second major bucket of our work is what we call collaborating for impact. So those are the sort of engagements, multi-year kind of direct one-on-one partnerships we have with human rights groups, collectives, and activists to support their advocacy campaigns and their use of video. In order to scale our work up and reach wider audiences, and the other big bucket of our work is what we call learning and sharing, which is where we take the things that we learn and develop in our collaborations and share that with the broader audience through trainings and workshops, through developing training materials, and through presentations like the one I'm doing today. And then finally, the fourth bucket is what we call systems change. So we know that human rights, doesn't happen in a vacuum, and that activists, just like all of us, are dependent on platforms like Facebook or Twitter, and of course impacted by global trends like misinformation. So we also do advocacy to technology companies, and we work in coalition with other civil society organizations who are working on these kinds of issues. So then just to get more concrete in terms of what we do and what issues we work on, we are, as I mentioned, a video organization. So what better way to explain that than through a video? So I'd like to just show you, it's one of our more recent videos, our 2020 year-end summary video. And so you'll get to see some of the work that we're doing and also hear from some of my colleagues from around the world from what they were working on. So I'll play the video and then we'll come back and talk a little bit about the work that Witness has been doing in Brazil.
Witness works globally, identifying gaps and co-developing strategies that help to maximize the potential of digital tools, while at the same time minimizing their associated risks. We are addressing the world's most complex and urgent challenges through a unique strategy that bridges the needs of communities with the global systems in which they live and work.
This year, Witness trained 1,300 community members, human rights defenders, media activists, journalists, and lawyers representing more than 27 countries. We created dozens of new resources addressing key skill set areas, including video as evidence, video advocacy, archiving, ethics, and safety and security. We created a COVID-19 response hub to provide tailored guidance, tip sheets, and tools for activists, healthcare workers, and other members of the public, and experimented with webinars, audio recordings for WhatsApp, and video-based tip sheets.
To ensure that people can create more trustworthy content that would meet the threshold of evidence in a court of law, we are creating this video resource to give some guidance and tips on how you could achieve that.
At the very beginning of the pandemic, we went very careful through the possibilities to keep using video. We went out to film, create a web series about the impacts of the pandemic on public health in Brazil, and that inspired a lot other video activists.
Much of Witness's strength lies in our unique ability to share what we learn across regions and issues, and connect the dots between activists, journalists, lawyers, and others in the fight for human rights. Last year, we created a crucial resource on how to document during internet shutdowns. That guidance has since been translated into more than a half dozen languages, reaching activists all over the world in their time of need. Meanwhile, as the volume of media continues to grow, our expertise on archiving, preservation, and database design is resonating with communities documenting state violence, environmental crimes, and other forms of injustice.
By improving the way that we manage our information, we can more quickly and effectively conduct investigations, organize justice campaigns, and challenge unjust laws, policies, and police practices.
For good or ill, online platforms are central to how marginalized communities communicate and organize. Witness continues to advocate to companies to reduce harms, ensuring that human rights users aren't shut out and that human rights content is not lost.
Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter are under a ton of pressure from governments to quickly get rid of the harmful stuff. But it's become a double-edged sword.
All these takedowns amount to erasing history and deleting crucial evidence that could be used to prosecute war crimes.
We continue to focus on emerging technologies that accentuate the challenges for trustworthy information, democracy, and human rights, such as deepfakes and other forms of media manipulation.
Consumption patterns have.
This year, we hosted a series of expert preparedness meetings across the Global South to ensure a globally inclusive, human rights-led prioritization of threats and needed solutions. What we learned during these meetings inform platform policies at both Facebook and Twitter and influence the development of an authenticity infrastructure that will be critical to help determine what is true and what has been manipulated.
We can't build a perfect system for everyone, but when we compromise, it's important to consider people with varying needs, especially outside the US and Europe.
On behalf of all of my colleagues around the world, but also the many activists and communities that we have the privilege to work with, we just want to say thank you for being such an instrumental and great partner. Thank you.
Okay, so hopefully that gave you a bit of an overview of the kind of work that we've been engaged in for the past year. And so now I just want to, oops, start that again. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the work that Witness has done in Brazil. We're really proud of our Brazil program. We've had a program here for more than a decade. I think the earliest partnership we did in Brazil was in 2007 with, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, I apologize in advance, Comissão Pastoral de Terra and Center for Justice and International Law. We co-produced a video called Bound by Promises, Contemporary Slavery in Rural Brazil that looked at conditions faced by seasonal agriculture workers who were recruited under false promises to work on estates where they were had been detained against their will, and this was taking place in the context of impunity and complicity of the state. And then starting in 2011 up to around 2016, in the lead up of the World Cup and the Olympics in Brazil, we supported communities in several cities who were facing forced evictions that were being done in the name of development leading up to these events. So for example, we co-produced a series of videos featuring residents from 4 different communities in Rio de Janeiro who were facing forced evictions. And those videos accompanied a report that was by a national human rights network in Brazil, and that was distributed to key decision makers and screened at a public hearing on housing violations that was held by the Federal Prosecutor's Office. And then in 2013, as those events were getting underway, we did a lot of work around documenting police brutality during protests that were taking place during those events, along with the sort of ongoing state violence, military operations and killings that were happening in favelas. So for instance, we work very closely with community activist groups like Coletivo Papo Reto from Complexo de Alamau, and who do work to share information and to defend the safety of their community and to do advocacy for their communities using video and social media. And so then from 2000, and so this work continues to this day, and then also starting from around 2016 to the present, we've continued that kind of work, but also starting to see a lot more violence directed at activists. As we see this, as the power of video documentation is becoming more evident, we're seeing a crackdown on activists, a crackdown on the rights to record, and in a context of increasing authoritarianism and surveillance. And we're also doing a lot more work to support indigenous communities in the Amazon and in other parts of the country who are working to defend their territories. So, as I've talked about, how we approach our work, and that is, we're seeing that in our work in Brazil as well, and all of our sort of interconnected activities. So, for instance, working directly with communities and listening and learning with them, creating spaces to build solidarity and to share information, such as organizing convenings and meetings and workshops to resist together. Engaging in rapid response in situations when they occur, providing support as needed, supporting advocacy campaigns with our partners, and then strengthening solidarity between communities, like locally, nationally, but also internationally as well. And if you're interested in learning more about the work that our Brazil team is up to, they have an amazing social media presence. So all the links are there, beautiful Instagram page and Facebook page and website as well. And you can follow them also at Witness Brazil on Twitter. So now I wanted to turn the presentation to share with you sort of the evolution and history of the Witness archives in the context of a Witness's own evolution, and in the context of the huge changes we've seen in the technological environment, in the way that video is being used by people around the world, and in a human rights context specifically. So I kind of just wanted to offer a rough, kind of walk you through a rough timeline of events. So as I mentioned, Witness started in 1992. So the first kind of chunk in our timeline I wanted to look at was sort of the 1990s to the mid 2000s. And at that time, we were focused on working with our partners to create short produced advocacy videos. So like edited with music and voiceover, that kind of thing. And we were using tape-based camcorders because that is what we had at the time. So for example, if you look at the photo on the top there, that is from 2006 and 2007 when we were working with the Center for Minority Rights Development and the Enderoy's Welfare Council and Minority Rights Group International to support a campaign by the Enderoy's community in Kenya, their indigenous community in Kenya, who were facing eviction from their land. And so, as you can see with the footage we shot with those camcorders, we produced a 9-minute video submission to the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. We also created another video for a broader audience that was used to direct attention to the eviction of the Enderoys, that was used in Kenya and also internationally. So those videos were produced with Semride and our other partners using, a very sort of traditional tape-based post-production workflow. And you can see that in the photo below. That's from 2006. That is a post-production session we did with our partner DROM, working on a video about the rights of Roma students in the Bulgarian school system. And for those of you who were around at that time, you probably remember that, video distribution was done on things like DVDs, and that was what we would use to, distribute our videos to key decision makers and to people who were, interested in seeing our work. So in that context, I just want to talk about, what our archive looked like at that time. So we had, obviously we were working on videotape. So we had a storage vault in our office to store those tapes. And you can see in the picture on the top, that was my former colleague, Grace Lyle, who managed our archives in the vault with our very neatly organized videotapes. And, we had a tape-based ingest and management workflow, which I'm going to explain in the next slide. We had our catalog, our video catalog was custom built in FileMaker Pro, which is just off-the-shelf database software. And, besides managing, cataloging, and storing our tapes, the other sort of parts of our work included like making dubs, for different types of access or purposes, and also doing, as I mentioned, DVD distribution. We also did DVD sales as well to like educational institutions who were interested in our advocacy work. So just to go into a little bit more detail about our tape ingest workflow at that time, it was very straightforward. We would receive tapes from our partners. Often they were coming to do a post-production, session in our office. We would create a record in our FileMaker catalog that also involved generating the identifiers, just alphanumeric identifiers, and then we would physically label our tapes and our discs with those identifiers, and you can see the small pictures on the far right with those identifiers. And then, depending on the situation, we would either create a master or a copy of that tape, like so a VHS access copy, and then another tape copy, either in the same format or in a different format, depending on the format. For mini DV later on, we would often just capture the mini DV to a DV file. But then very often, we would just collect the tapes, identify them, and put them in storage, and there would be no sort of copying and capture of the material. And then finally, of course, we would move the tapes to our physical storage, which we had in-house, and you can see a picture of it below. Compact shelving, and it was in a climate-controlled room, basically. So, as I mentioned, many of the tapes, were either copied to other tapes or were never captured or copied at all. And so in later years, just kind of skipping ahead in the timeline, this did create a need for us to digitize those tapes. And we were able to digitize, many of our tapes, but not all of them, with support of amazing interns, archives graduate students, taking on sort of small scale digitization projects in the later years. So here in this picture, you can see one of our former interns at the digitization station we had set up, capturing a mini DV collection we had that was about youth incarceration in the United States. So going back to our timeline, I wanted to jump back. So now into the late 2000s and early 2010, we were still co-producing these kind of short form edited advocacy videos. But what was changing was that we're starting to see a shift to file-based cameras and file-based post-production workflows. And in the photo on the top, you can see my colleague Priscilla, who was training activists, and again, I apologize for my pronunciation, in Novo Pinheiro, using, you can see in her hand, a flip camera. And flip cameras were kind of very early, easy to use, low cost handheld cameras. They were sort of in the beginnings of that. And then later you see in the photo below, one of our partners from Likido in Cambodia using a DSLR. DSLRs became increasingly popular as a tool for capturing really high quality video at a comparatively lower cost than prosumer or professional video cameras. And so that was a very, often being used by video documenters. So with all of these, new types of cameras, we were seeing video becoming much more accessible and increasingly used by activists to document human rights violations all around the world. And of course, I'm sure you're all familiar with the fact that around this time, we saw the emergence of, online video streaming with things like YouTube. So in terms of the implication for our archive, during that time, we expanded our digital storage system to handle, tens of terabytes of content. We developed ingest workflows for our digital items, which I'll talk about next. We expanded our catalog to be able to describe digital items. And then, eventually we discontinued our older distribution methods, so no more DVDs. So our digital ingest workflow, not too complicated, but so we would receive footage from our team or from our partners on drives or devices. So that photo on the very top is an example of what a hard drive might look like that we would receive. Then we would create a record, and we were still using our FileMaker database. We would create a record and identifiers, similar to how we created identifiers for the tapes. But instead of physically labeling the tape, we would create a folder or a container in our digital storage with that identifier. So that's that second picture you see below. It's an example of a folder that has the unique identifier within in the folder name. We would then, copy our archival information package or whatever you want to call it to that container that was created in our digital storage. And then we would connect that item or that digital item to our catalog and extract the technical metadata from those files to populate the catalog record. And you can see that in the picture, just an excerpt below. And then we also had a process for generating hashes, so checksums basically, and access low-res access copies of those digital files. So then the next sort of stage in the timeline is sort of the leading up to the present. So sort of around the mid 1910s till now. I think you're all familiar with the shift, away from standalone video cameras to cameras being available on mobile phones almost ubiquitously. During this time, we also saw a shift to emphasis more on the use of video as in the form of raw documentation or as evidence versus highly edited productions. And so in the photo you see here is a partner that we worked with previously called We Cop Watch in the United States, who were using mobile phones to document police stops in their community. We also saw the growth of, different, even beyond YouTube, other forms of decentralized distribution. So for instance, video on social media, video being shared on chat apps and other forms of distribution. And so, since in that context, since we weren't bringing footage together for use in for post-production or for creating short-form advocacy videos to the same extent anymore, and since partners were presented with many new potential uses for their videos, not just having a single edited video production for use with advocacy, but opportunities to use, to create collections of raw documentation that could be used for evidentiary purposes or other purposes. And with this sort of decentralization of the ways that they could share those videos in different ways and use them in different ways, it made sense for us to shift from collecting videos ourselves to supporting partners with their own archiving and media management so that they could retain their own collections and use them in all the various different ways towards their own advocacy goals and in their own campaigns. So an example of this that I wanted to share, and you saw a little bit of this in the video that I played earlier, is a partnership that we've been involved in for the last few years with Berkeley Cop Watch. Berkeley Cop Watch is an organization in California. They've been around for the last 30 years also, and they regularly run Cop Watch patrols in their community, which is Berkeley, California. Focusing on documenting, use of excessive force, documenting the ways that the police target unhoused people and people who are experiencing, mental illness in the community. They do a lot of advocacy around alternatives to policing and getting law enforcement out of response to mental health crises. So when we started working with Berkeley Cop Watch, they had a database, but it was very outdated. They were not really using it that much. It was, not, they weren't relying on it for tracking, the incidents that they were documenting. And they had a very ad hoc approach to making sure that the videos that they were collecting the videos that they were filming were being collected and archived. But they did see a lot of potential use for their documentation, such as for doing people's investigations or for use in advocacy campaigns. And that potential that wasn't being harnessed because they didn't have everything assembled in one place and organized and searchable. So we connected with them, and building off a previous project that we did with another Cop Watch organization called El Grito, we did a project with them called Profiling the Police. We worked with Berkeley Cop Watch to create new ingest workflows for their video, to create a new data model for a database. And we created a new database for tracking police officers, policing incidents, and also that was connected to their video media as well. And then we were able to migrate all of their old data, which was great that they had that into the new database so that it would be more usable and so that they could create new data in it as well. So since that time, they're actively using the database, and they used the information they collected in it to run a campaign that led to a resignation of an officer who had appeared over 20 times in 20 different incidents in their database. They've been conducting people's investigations where they present information that they've collected. They've done video analysis alongside people who are directly impacted by police abuse, and public events featuring advocates and journalists and other local policymakers. The other part of this project has been that we created documentation of the project along with Berkeley CopWatch. And, together we published this documentation. So the data model, the data dictionary, the controlled vocabulary, the workflows, along with the database template so that other people don't have to start from scratch if they want to do a similar project. So last year we started sharing these resources. We've published them so anyone can just go on the website that's linked there below and download them themselves. And we've done, various trainings and workshops to in hopes that other CopWatch groups might be able to take advantage of these resources. And besides, this particular resource that we created with Berkeley CopWatch, we also have a lot of other archives resources that are available at the links that you see here: archiving.witness.org, blog.witness.org, and library.witness.org. We have an activist guide to archiving video. We have various videos about archiving. We have short form resources such as a tip sheet on the sort of decision tree tip sheet on should I collect and archive these videos at all. We have blog posts such as one on how to download live streams and other videos from social media. So there are a lot of resources that we have available for anyone to access. I just wanted to also share this because this is the opportunity I had to work with some activists in Brazil a couple of years ago. As I mentioned, we often do trainings and workshops. This was from a Right to Record convening we had in Niterói and Rio in 2019. Featured, activists who were, documenting police abuse, land defense movements, youth and students' rights activists. And we had, multi-day training where we talked about all kinds of things, including archiving, and we're able to, everybody was able to share their knowledge and expertise. And it was a really beautiful event in a very beautiful setting. But of course, with this sort of shift in the way that we approach our archives program towards this more post-custodial model, we still do have our collection that we're responsible for. So around 2 years ago, we started partnering with the City of Malmö Archives in Sweden. The Malmö Archives is actually a very special archive in that they are dedicated to promoting freedom of expression. They've hosted several safe haven conferences. The Malmö, Sweden is an icon city for artists at risk. And they've been involved in drafting things like guidelines on principles for safe havens for archives at risk. So the Malmö City Archives have established a rescue archive for the archives of cultural workers, journalists, writers, and NGOs. So we've partnered with them to transfer our collection there for long-term preservation and sort of broader access, research access than we're able to provide, ourselves to our collection. Within our organization, in terms of our own, use and access to our collection, we're undergoing a big shift to a cloud-based infrastructure to serve our global team better. And so that is underway as well. And of course, none of this is easy. Still have many ongoing challenges, as I think anyone who works in an archive has. So we are partnering with Malmö, but we still have there are a lot of tapes that need to be digitized. So that is still, hopefully, Malmö will be able to support with that, but there's still a lot of work to be done. It's always an issue with having enough resources to maintain and preserve the collection, updating and maintaining our workflows, doing the cataloging, keeping the infrastructure going. So there are still challenges, despite moving ahead as well as we can. So finally, I just wanted to close my presentation by just kind of pointing or looking into the future a little bit. and just pointing at some of the emerging challenges and opportunities for audiovisual human rights archives. So of course, from a technological perspective, we're seeing a lot of new platforms that are audiovisual centric, where audiovisual content is being shared. So platforms like TikTok and others. I think the volume of audiovisual content is just going to keep on growing exponentially. So, thinking about archives, that people are recording more than can ever be preserved or even discovered. And so how do we approach selection and appraisal in that context? There's also new audiovisual forms emerging. So, augmented reality and virtual reality and all these kinds of new audiovisual technologies. In a sort of more political and social context, we see an increase in social media content moderation and removals happening. These platforms are relying more on artificial intelligence tools to do takedowns at a rapid pace, often before a post has even had a single view. And so obviously, while moderation is necessary and needed to keep harmful information from spreading, it also catches a lot of human rights content and content with other informational and evidentiary value in that. So that's something to think about. There's also the context of, increasing authoritarianism and heavy-handed tactics being taken by states globally, resulting in increased risk to documenters, to activists, to ordinary people who are taking part, let's say, in protests. Another trend we're seeing is internet shutdowns. So as coalitions like Keep It On are tracking, we see states increasingly using shutdowns to stop people from sharing and accessing information online. And the next point, I think, we're all familiar with, that globally we're seeing a rise in misinformation and erosion of trust. And, on the flip side of that, there are these kind of new emerging approaches to ensuring and determining authenticity. So, obviously, these issues of trust and authenticity and information are key concerns for archives. So, what is the role that archives and archivists play in dealing with these new trends? Deepfakes and synthetic media are kind of one type of misinformation that's directly related to audiovisual. So I just wanted to highlight that. And deepfake technology is developing at a very rapid pace. So how do archives respond to that? So with that, I was going to draw my presentation to a close. If you want to reach out to me, that is my email and my Twitter handle. So I will stop sharing my screen so I can see Ines again, and we can have a little time for a chat.
Yes, we have about 20 minutes.
Okay.
And I'm just amazed on how much work Witness present to us, how much. So I wonder, I have a few questions. I wonder if you could share with us how does Witness react to a crisis? Like, for instance, we have many uprisings. We had Tunisia, Myanmar, now Colombia is going for its second month of daily protests, and we have a lot of those issues you mentioned, the internet shutdown, and for instance, the media itself is presenting one side of. So how does Witness react as an organization for crises like this one?
I mean, I think our approach is always to collaborate and work with communities and organizations who who are directly impacted and who have been working on these issues, in their regions for a long time, and to provide, to support, and to, in places where there's a need that is a need that we can fill, a gap that we can fill, then we do that. We always try to follow the lead of the local organizations, and sort of more of a support role. So people might reach out to us. As I mentioned, a big part of what we do is like building relationships and trust over a long period of time. And so, we're present in those coalitions, in those groups. And so it's sort of about keeping your ears open and anticipating, and then responding when it's needed and wanted.
And providing so many tools. It was a one quick slide, but if the audience is interested, there are so many tools available at Witness website. And
as I mentioned, we've been doing this work for a long time, and a lot of these human rights issues are long-standing issues that you'll see sometimes in the news, like something will come up and it'll be like very present in people's minds, but that those issues aren't necessarily didn't come out of just nowhere. So for instance, just last year, for instance, in the United States, when protests erupted around the killing of George Floyd, we've been doing work around police accountability for a long time before that. And so when that happened, we had a lot of resources that we had already created that we were able to share with wider audiences, because we already had those resources created. And so it was great that we were able to reach people with those resources, that we had them already.
Just for the audience to know that there is a Brazilian page of Witness with a lot of content already in Portuguese. One of which, the Witness Guide to Archiving Videos, was translated in a partnership with the ABPA, Audiovisual Preservation, Brazilian Audiovisual Preservation Association.
So we're very grateful for that, and it's always amazing to be able to work with them to make that resource available in Portuguese.
Yes, so it's a very extent list of resources available, and it's good. You can see also the shift. Your Witness is up to the new, like the emerging technologies, and you promoted many discussions on deepfake. For instance, it's something that we as archivists and also human rights watcher must be aware of. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the decision to have your collection this shift to another archive, and also being cloud-based. For instance, in Brazil perspective, we cannot have our strategy as cloud-based, because there are so many uncertainty in funding, and so we usually don't regard this solution. And I know, since Witness is a solid institution with it's another perspective, so I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about this.
Yeah, sure. So just starting with the first part of your question, our partnership with the Malmo City Archives. I mean, sustainability is a big question. So, even though Witness is an established organization, as you're saying, we're still a nonprofit human rights organization. We're not a collecting institution. So just like recognizing that the video collection we have is like extremely valuable and unique. We have, human rights, stories collected from the last 30 years that we don't have the capacity to preserve ourselves. And so if we, as I mentioned, we have a lot of tapes that weren't digitized, and that the sort of the deadline for analog tapes to be digitized is like it's now. There's no more machines being manufactured. The tapes are degrading. So really, we did have to take some action. If we want that documentation to survive and be able for anyone to use in the future, we needed to find sort of a solution for that. And so, the Malmo City Archives, they are really sustainable compared to to a nonprofit organization like Witness. Like they have collections going back to the Middle Ages. They're very established. So, we came to our decision because of their focus on freedom of expression, on human rights, on providing a safe haven for human rights records, and they understanding the sensitivities around human rights collections. So it was a matter of thinking into the future and preservation and sustainability and the realities of what kind of resources we had. In terms of the cloud, I mean, again, it is like looking at the realities sort of as well. So we are a global team, and there are sort of just needs for our day-to-day functioning that things are accessible. And, of course, the security precautions are being taken in terms of how we will access the stuff on the materials in the cloud. But, maintaining your own equipment has costs as well. So if you're thinking about it from a cost perspective, there's also costs in keeping up your own hardware and infrastructure and security and everything, and having, your global team, and so trying to support your global team yourself. So, I mean, it's a transition that's still happening. So, it's not everything is figured out yet, but it is sort of something that we, have to consider.
Okay, and switching to Witness Brazil, I wonder if you could talk a little further. You mentioned the Right to Record event that was great. You promote. There are many projects towards social transformation and the usage of audiovisual as human rights violation, as an evidence of human rights violation. You mentioned the forced evictions. So I wonder if you could talk a little. I do know it's not directly to your work, but since we are talking to a Brazilian audience, I wonder if you could talk a little further about it.
Well, as you mentioned, it's we do have a team, our Witness Brazil team, and I've collaborated with the team, and I was fortunate enough to travel to Rio a couple of years ago to participate in that training. I feel a little bit weird speaking to our Brazil work to to a Brazilian audience when I'm not the expert on that sort of local context, but yeah, I mean they're doing really amazing work in terms of looking at like threats to activists and to people who are documenting, advocating for the right to document and record, working with local collectives and activist groups who are doing documentation, especially around, as I mentioned, police abuse, and state violence.
Yeah, I remember a project on the traces of bullets that were shot by helicopter in communities, and that's quite a work, and I congratulated the team for that.
Yeah. I know there was a project that recently came out that I think we played a little part in looking at doing a sort of in-depth analysis those, the shootings from the helicopters. Yeah, it's tragic.
Indeed. So I wonder, there is something. It's a fragile issue, having those evidence in social media, where it's the company itself has policies towards violence in images. So could you please comment on the relationship of Witness itself towards those companies? Did you ever had any sort of direct contact or?
Yeah, I mean, part of our work involves doing advocacy to the technology companies and having, some contact. Obviously they are vast global corporations and we're just a tiny little human rights organization. So, but yeah, I mean, it's, I think archivists are familiar with the idea that social media platforms and YouTube aren't archives, and they're not meant to be archives. And, but unfortunately, like, they are the platforms that are available to people, and they're the ways that people use to get information out. But, we can't rely on them to preserve or to even just keep available important human rights documentation. So, ideally, like, people if it's even safe for them to do so, they keep copies of their own media. There are not just us, but many other human rights organizations who do work to get content that's been taken down reinstated, for example. There's a lot of people doing advocacy around that, and content is getting reinstated in some instances. And there's some content that shouldn't go back up necessarily, but that should be preserved. And so there are, we're part of groups who are looking into options for that as well. So, like, it's valuable as evidence, but maybe doesn't, not necessarily has to stay up on, on social media.
We're almost at the end. I wonder if you could, I think I covered many of the issues I wanted. So I wonder if you would like to say final words, or if you have something else you would like to bring to this discussion.
I mean, I guess just that it's, in the last several years, it's been interesting to see how much the issue of archives and archiving has become so relevant in the human rights documentation, human rights world and human rights documentation world. There's like a lot of interest and need, I think, for, archival practices, standards, workflows, know-how, skills. I'm seeing that a lot. So, so I think there is like a important role for people with archives training or archives interests, or people who work as archivists, or, archive organizations to support human rights activists where they are.
Well, that's quite a challenge. And I think in Brazil, we do have the challenge to recognize what is being shared in social network as also a historical document. Mm-hmm. We are way ahead on this discussion, the practice itself of, okay, it's not only the video, but maybe the tweet itself and the whole discussion that happens around the video. So it's something that I pledge to my colleagues. We should take a careful look into that. And so I thank you once more, Yvonne. It was such a pleasure. I think it's I think that the work of Witness is never been so important because of this the recent shift in technology and what's happening in many countries around the world. So I thank you once more for sharing with us. I'm gonna say, oh, sorry.
No, just thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
I'm going to say some final words in Portuguese. And thank you once more. And agradecemos a nossa convidada, Yvonne Ng, e a vocês que nos assistiram. Acompanhe e participe gratuitamente da programação da 16ª Cineop, que acontece no site cineop.com.br até o dia 28 de junho. Obrigada pela participação e até a próxima.